Hey guys, welcome back to our April 28th video lecture for week 6. Today we are talking about President Kennedy abroad. So topics like the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin Wall, so on and so forth. Let's get right into it. So Cuba turns red. In 1959, communist revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro ousted the Cuban dictator Batista. Now, once in power, Castro would establish strong ties with the Soviet Union, and the USSR would send advisors, weapons, and immense financial aid to the young Cuban dictator. Obviously, for the United States, this is a major blow to the policy of containment. We're trying to keep communism at bay, so to speak. And instead of keeping communism at bay, communism has now come to the United States backyard. As Floridians, we know how significant Cuban culture is to us. We know how close we are to Cuba in a literal sense. So having a communist regime a mere 90 miles off the Florida coast was concerning. Having a communist regime with ICBMs 90 miles off the United States coastline, that is immensely concerning. And that's going to be the main topic for today. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. Fleeing to the Sunshine State. Averse to living under a communist regime, many Cubans fled the island. Most of their exiles, or people who live outside their home country, settled in southern Florida. We can still see that cultural impact today. Shortly after taking office, Kennedy learned that the CIA was training some of these Cuban exiles in Florida and Guatemala as guerrilla fighters. Their covert mission was to return to Cuba and lead a popular uprising that would topple Castro and his regime. Sounds good on paper. It didn't work out exactly that way. Okay, moving on to our next slide. Kennedy takes aim at Castro. The CIA officials who briefed Kennedy on the Cuban invasion plan assured the new president that their invasion would inspire Cubans to rise up and rebel against Castro. Eager to demonstrate his strength as a Cold War president, Kennedy would approve this invasion plan. This was a bad decision by President Kennedy, to say the least. Okay. Next slide. The Bay of Pigs disaster. On April 17th, 1961, a small army of Cuban exiles sailed into the Bay of Pigs in southern Cuba. Their landing was, in no uncertain terms, a disaster. CIA trainers told the exiles they would come ashore on an empty beach, but their boats ran aground on a coral reef. And once the exiles reached land, Cuban troops quickly killed or captured all of them. Meanwhile, the expected public uprising never occurred. There was no support within Cuba for this uprising. A few officials tried to persuade Kennedy to send U.S. warplanes to support the exile forces, but Kennedy did not want to involve the United States further in this poorly executed fiasco. That was probably a good call. At some point, the quickest way to get out of a hole is to put down the shovel and stop digging. This was a disaster. If we had committed further, there's a good chance it would have just made a bad problem worse. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Berlin comes into focus. We talked about the partitioning of Germany. We talked about the partitioning of Berlin. We talked about the Berlin airlift. But problems still exist within Berlin, and they're going to exist until the fall of what becomes known as the Berlin Wall in 1990. So this problem is far from over. In June of 1961, Kennedy and the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev organized a summit meeting in Vienna, Austria. Summit meetings are held by heads of state to discuss important topics. The topic of the day for this summit meeting was what to do about Berlin. The Soviets want the city in its entirety. Berlin was located 100% within the Eastern Germany. and felt like these occupation zones in Western Berlin needed to go. Kennedy disagreed wholeheartedly. From the end of World War II, Berlin, like I said, was that divided city. And the question is, for the Soviets, how do we get them out of Berlin? We just aren't going to leave. So East Berlin in distress. Next slide. The border between Eastern and Western Europe was eventually closed everywhere, with the exception of Berlin, because again, it is that partitioned city. As a result, Berlin became the only escape route for hundreds of thousands of East Germans trapped behind what became known as the Iron Curtain. By 1961, as many as 25,000 East German refugees were crossing into Berlin every single day. This is devastating the East German workforce, understandably so. They aren't going to allow them to continue crossing into West Berlin. So the reaction of the Soviet Union is to build a wall. This wall becomes known as the Berlin Wall. At the Vienna summit, Khrushchev informed Kennedy that he would not allow the flow of refugees into Berlin, or rather West Berlin, to continue. Kennedy responded that he was prepared to defend West Berlin, even at the risk of war. Khrushchev decided that East Germany's only remaining option was to wall itself off from Western Berlin. On August 13, 1961, East German workers began constructing a barbed wire fence around East and West Berlin. Later, the government replaced the fence with tall concrete walls. The Berlin Wall made it all but impossible for East Germans to escape to freedom in West Berlin. The United States and other Western European nations were outraged by the building of this wall. Understandably so. So Kennedy decides that it's time to visit Berlin itself. And this is what he said. There are many people in the world who really don't understand, or say they don't, what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin. There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin. Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put up a wall to keep our people in. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin, and therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner, meaning I am a Berliner. I am from Berlin. He said this on June 26, 1963. Despite this, Kennedy was not willing to risk war to tear down the wall. Although he hates the wall, he's not going to start a war over a wall. And he said a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war. I think we can all agree with that. Moving on to the next slide. A startling discovery. Just over a year after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, President Kennedy focused his attention on Cuba again. Really, the proximity of Cuba is what makes it such a complex problem. In October of 1962, a U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba discovered that the Soviets were building missile launching sites on the island. Again, this is just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. This is a major problem for the national security of the United States. From these sites, missiles carrying nuclear warheads could easily reach most major cities in the United States. That's a problem. Okay. Next slide. How to handle the Soviet aggression. To discuss U.S. response strategies, Kennedy assembled a group of his 12 most trusted advisors, called the Executive Committee for National Security, later known as EXCOM. Its members agreed that the United States must halt construction of the Soviet missile sites. Failure to remove this threat would endanger American cities and make the United States seem weak to European allies and anti-Castro forces in Latin America. So what to do? There's going to be a number of suggestions. You can only pursue one of them. The EXCOM could not agree on how to handle the Cuban Missile Crisis. Some advisors urged the president to bomb the missile sites before construction could be completed. Others suggested blockading Cuba to prevent Soviet ships from bringing missiles to the island. The blockade was referred to as the quarantine plan. Now, this actually should ring some bells. The United States did this during the Civil War to the South. Again, that was known as the Anaconda Plan. Make it so difficult for supplies to flow into the South that you almost just choke them off. That is the idea with the quarantine plan. What's already in Cuba is already there, but we can try to prevent more material from coming to Cuba. This is the course that he chooses. He chooses to go with the quarantine plan. Okay, next slide. Missiles in Cuba. On October 22nd, Kennedy publicly revealed the discovery of the missile sites and his decision to quarantine Cuba. He warned that the United States would view any nuclear missile attack from Cuba as a Soviet Union attack on the United States. He also demanded that the Soviets remove all offensive weapons from the island. Next slide. Eyeball to eyeball. For the next 2 days, Soviet ships continued to move towards Cuba, all the while knowing we are blockading Cuba. Fearing that the United States could be on the brink of nuclear war, Kennedy put the U.S. military on high alert. "I guess this is the week I earn my salary," he nervously joked. On October 24th, Khrushchev ordered Soviet ships approaching Cuba to either slow down or turn around. Secretary of State Dean Rusk commented, "We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." Khrushchev appeals to Kennedy. A few days later, Khrushchev sent a note to Kennedy agreeing to remove Soviet missiles from Cuba if Kennedy agreed to end the Cuban blockade and promised not to invade Cuba. The next day, Khrushchev sent a second note. Here, he proposed removing the Cuban missiles if the United States promised to also remove its missiles in Turkey, which bordered on the USSR. A deal is struck. Believing the U.S. missiles in Turkey were outdated, Kennedy had already decided to remove them. However, he did not want Khrushchev to think that the United States was yielding to Soviet demands. So the ex-com advised Kennedy to pretend he did not receive the second note. Publicly, Kennedy accepted the first deal. Privately, he sent Robert Kennedy to the Soviet embassy to mediate the second deal. And on October 28th, Khrushchev agreed to remove all Soviet missiles from Cuba. About 3 months later, the United States would remove our outdated missiles from Turkey. All right? This is one of those events in world history that, unless you lived through it, I don't think you can fully understand it. Just how close the world came to nuclear warfare. Right? Complete destruction of wide swaths of land. You'd be talking about hundreds of millions of people dead. We were so close to the brink. Fortunately, President Kennedy was able to strike a deal during that time. All right. Tomorrow we're going to continue talking about President Kennedy, the tragic end of his life. Obviously, the immense controversy that still surrounds his death. But as always, I hope you guys are well. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I will see you tomorrow. Have a good day. Bye.